Welcome to the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Long-term business survives because it can create maximum profits over the long term. And the only way a business creates maximum profit is to first live a people-first culture. This podcast brings you people who have wonderful backgrounds and experiences in this space. And today I am thrilled to have Christine Crandell with us. Christine has worked in the B2B world. She's been a board member, an advisor, a counselor. She works in marketing and digital transformation as a consultant. Her superpower is driving growth based on user experience and customer success. Welcome, Christine.
Oh, thank you, Rick. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, I would love to have you give us your story. How did I met Christine through her writing. And I think we had a personal introduction at some point, but I have followed her writing for a long time. She's written for the Huffington Post, for Forbes, Columnist for Forbes.com, and I see her on LinkedIn. And so that's where I got fascinated with your work. So if you'd be kind enough to both share your background and kind of how you got here, but also when I looked at your LinkedIn profile, there's this statement on your profile about authoring and leading the implementation of the seller's compass, a methodology which is a step-by-step proven pathway to aligning culture, people, process, strategy, and technology to meet customer expectations. I love that. So would you give us an intro and tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So let me just start off really quick. My background is and has been a serial CMO for public and private companies. I did a lot of work international. I grew up in Europe, and then moved to the States when I was in my later teens. So I've maintained a very global perspective. And I think that's really important because if we don't travel and we don't do business in other countries, you don't start to realize that at a macro level, we are all the same. We may eat differently, dress differently, pray differently, but we all have the same aspirations and the same fears and the same desires. So that kind of grounding really carried with me, and I share that because it becomes very important a little bit later on. But my background, as I said, was public CMO. So I've been with Ariba and SAP and Oracle, all of the very great logos. What happened at Ariba was when I came to Ariba, which is now part of SAP, the stock had gone through a crash, and it wasn't necessarily unique to Ariba. It was the time of the market, and we were basically turning this company around. We were going from procurement, which will solicit quite a rather large yawn, and repositioning it into something called spend management, which is really what it's known as today, sourcing and spend management. And if for your audience who's been in marketing for a while, you're going to chuckle when you hear this because we have this problem today. That means that, I was looking at campaign performance because I do believe marketing, this is some time ago, carries a number. I carried a number. I was one of the few CMOs that carried a number because marketing generates revenue. And you have campaigns that perform quite predictably, and then all of a sudden they don't. Yeah. Right? You have sales guys that are doing tactics and doing their own activities, and that they are very productive, and all of a sudden they're not. And going through and unraveling that Gordian knot is what started where I am today. And we were going through and saying, why is that? What was actually happening? And so we looked first internally, right? Okay, what are we doing wrong, right? Let's go relook at our Salesforce system and at our CRM system. Okay, we went through sales and marketing alignment, which is, very essential and important, and that, fixed some problems, but didn't fix predictability, meaning I couldn't go into the CFO's office and say, with a degree of confidence, you're going to give me 10 million, or you're going to give me 15 million in funds, and I'm going to deliver for you X number of million in booked revenue or X number of million in later stage pipeline, right? And that's what I wanted to get to, is because for me, it's all about the numbers. And to make the long story very short, in continuing of optimizing the organization and continuing to do experimentation, I started spending a lot of time with customers. What were they doing? What was going on? And lo and behold, at that time, again, this is 10 years ago or plus, the customers were changing. They were like, I don't need to go to the sales guy anymore for information. I have this thing called Google. And I, a customer can now control my journey. I decide when I wish to engage. I decide how I wish to engage. And it was those evolving customer expectations of interaction and what value meant, how value was defined, that really was the key to this understanding, this predictability, and coming up with the predictability. So what came out of this was this aha in my brain that says, what, we've had a tectonic shift. We've had a paradigm shift, not in the popular sense, in the true definition, that the customer is now in control. Of course, us in marketing and sales really didn't want to necessarily believe that, because it creates all sorts of fears and uncertainty. But in the end, I said, my view was marketing and strategy and sales need to fundamentally change. They need to be rooted in that customer expectation. And I started, I have an academic background, a pretty deep academic background. And so I started applying what I had used when I went to get my doctorate to say, okay, let me forensically understand what is going on within customers. And that birthed the seller's compass. And the seller's compass is a framework and a methodology, but the framework is probably the most important piece, that literally lays out the journey through the eyes of the customer. And it at a macro, so we're like 5 miles above the earth, right? At a macro level, my expectation was, and this is for the entire journey, pre and post purchase, my expectation was this is only going to apply to B2B SaaS software, right? It's not going to apply anywhere else, because that was my background. Lo and behold, this model has held from education through discrete manufacturing, through distribution. It is held across countries. It is held, it continues to hold, and it's valid. And again, because it was developed as a result of lots and lots and lots of interviews, qualitative interviews that were done with buyers and buying teams, asking questions such as, who did you talk to? What did you do? Why did you do that? When did you do this? And so it is from the buyer's perspective, right? And that is this foundation. It says, if we understand what that buyer is trying to do, right? What they define as their outcome. People don't buy software just for the giggles, right? They're buying software to achieve an outcome. What is their emotion as they go through that? What is their sentiment as they go through that? What is it that's in it for them? Meaning, what is it that's personally at stake? Again, what's in the head and what's in the heart? Then it becomes a very, very simple to optimize your marketing and optimize your sales in order to drive revenue and to drive ROI, because the context is now from the buyer. The context isn't from egocentric vendor, right? Saying, I have this, that, or the other. And in fact, if you look at most products that do, or most brands that do very well, their products are okay. It's okay, right? They're not 100% perfect. They're not terrible. They're not 100% perfect. But what sets apart those brands is one, the understanding of that customer and the alignment with that customer and those customers' expectations, and nurturing that customer in the areas that they really care to be. I was on a call this morning, another journey mapping interview this morning, in which the person's, basically said, all I really want is I want the brand I do business with to care, right? Be responsive, tell me the truth, and care, right? It's okay, it doesn't do X, Y, and Z. I can go deal with that some other way. And so that is actually the secret sauce behind the seller's compass. And there's there's a methodology on how to go do that, and how to optimize it, and how it influences your culture, and how it influences your strategy, and how you actually can drive your M&A strategy. There's a lot of that stuff underneath it, but that is the seller's compass.
I love it. And someday we'll have to have another talk, because your work is even more aligned to what we do than I realized before I asked you that question. And I love the recognition of the value being transferred is about the buyer's frame of reference as to value. We don't get to sit at headquarters and decide how valuable what we're doing is. The customer gets to decide how valuable what we're doing is. And that leads me to another. Today, it's a very common conversation. How do you think about the purpose of the selling organization in that equation? Because people talk about purpose helping to attract the right employees and the right customers. And how does that fit into that equation?
That's a really good question. Because if we don't understand the buyer, and we're using a very generic term, buyer, right? And in the B2B world, there are buying teams, which is comprised of multiple personas, right? And each of those personas, or each of those buying team members, has their own differences and their own definitions. And in the consumer world, it's the consumer. Where sales kind of comes into this is where I actually have an awful lot of empathy for sales organizations, because their job is really hard. On one side of the equation, it's about, where's your quota? You got to make a quota. Where's your pipeline? How, the days the deal has been out there, why is it not progressing to the next stage? And yet on the other side, there is this expectation, again, this is in the B2B world, there is this expectation from that prospect that is not rooted in the product, meaning it is rooted in this understanding of, I'm trying to achieve X, right? And what I really want out of this is I want a relationship, and I want to know you care, yes. And I want to know you're going to be there, and I know that I can trust you, and I know that you're going to have my back when things go wrong, because they inevitably do go wrong at some point in time, and so value is not inherent in the product. So let me give you an example. So we did some work some years ago for this amazing company called New Pig. Yes, New and Pig, the one with the 4 little legs. They are specialists, discrete manufacturer and distributor. They're specialists in leaks and spills. So if you've been in manufacturing, take it from oil rigs to clean rooms to surgical rooms, things spill, right? And OSHA and FDA and all these guys are very clear on how you must, pick those spills up. You don't pick up hydrochloric acid with sawdust. Is generally not a good idea. You have to do certain things, right? And so in their particular world, where they sell to, large plants, I mean, we're talking big plants and also little plants, the value of their product is in the relationship, meaning that what their customers really wanted and what their customers really found as the definition of value was, yes, we are in compliant with regulations to pick up this spill. But more importantly, I've known Joe, the salesperson, for the past 10 years, and Joe knows me, and he comes out once a year. And yeah, we talk about my kids' baseball, But Joe then goes around my plant and starts asking me, what about new equipment? What about new chemicals that I'm bringing on? Let's talk about new regulation. If I'm in California, what's with the storm drain, right? How am I compliant with the storm drain? That value is inherent and sits in that relationship, right? And Joe going back and saying, you know what, there's this regulation coming down from the FDA. In order to be compliant, I recommend A, B, C, and D, right? That is probably one of the clearest examples I have of value, whether the new pig sock, which is a device or this thing that soaks up, water, right? Whether it's this long or that long, or whether you get a price break for buying 200 of them versus 50 of them is almost, not quite, but almost irrelevant, right? Yeah. The value sits in that salesperson. And so for the salesperson, the cognitive dissonance is taking this relationship that the customer values and translating it back into your pipeline forecast.
Yes, yeah. And one of the things, and correct me if I'm on the wrong page, but too often senior management only thinks in this month's numbers or this quarter's numbers or even this year's numbers. And in the story, I think the example you're setting is there's a long-term play in these relationships, and that salesperson that you give as an example is really setting this up to be a reoccurring client for a decade, as opposed to just for a quarter. Am I on the right page there?
We're both you're absolutely on the right page. And part of that is driven by, how we report to Wall Street. We are, because of Wall Street's format, we are quarterly focused, right? We have to report to Wall Street. We have to give them, earnings forecasts and in managing their expectations. And so that comes from the top and it trickles down the organization. What it creates, however, is what we see in many companies, right? Is this focus on buy more. I've been a customer of Verizon long before it was ever Verizon. Way back when they used to be called McCall Cellular, and they were phenomenal. Verizon could care less whether I've been a customer for 25 years. Only thing Verizon cares about is that I buy their new phone. And so this kind of a mindset creates this, what I call this non-caring kind of attitude that you see when you go into stores, that you see when you're dealing with many organizations where you're just a number and you call the contact center and the agent is being compensated on one and done, right? And being compensated on the shortest amount of time possible. And so you get punted off. I just went through this with Federal Express and, wow. So it takes, it takes a mindset shift at the executive management level, at the CEO level, to understand about being customer driven or being people first. It's not rhetoric. It doesn't belong in marketing. It's not, we're not going to hire a chief customer officer and go like, yeah, well, that's Sally's job. It truly is a mindset shift that has to happen. And customer experience, if we want to use that word, is a business discipline, just as strategy is a business discipline, just as finance is a business discipline. And that's where a lot of companies go wrong.
Now, it's interesting as I'm listening, when we talk about maximizing profits after you've optimized people first culture, as you're describing the challenge of sales or marketing or customer service, you got to get off the phone quick, or you have to get another number. After what you've seen and who you've worked with and where you've been, what do you think those short-term strategies, this quarter kind of strategies, do to the culture?
It numbs the culture. If I don't care for my customer, meaning that if the metrics, because people only do what they're paid to do, right?
Yeah.
And if the metrics are, and let's take the contact center because it's a great example, are on one and done, are on, first time resolution, get off the phone, how long have you been on the phone? Then it telegraphs to that employee that we don't care about the customer, and subliminally, we don't care about our employees, right? And I kind of have a smile on my face when over the past several years, there's been a lot of talk about employee satisfaction and employee engagement, employee. We all need to retain the employee, but yet it is juxtaposition to the fact that we still treat customers as if they are a number, or as if it's, they represent value, right? Meaning how much revenue is attached to that customer and how is it measured by customer lifetime value, right? CLV. And I think what's coming, which I find, and if I'm getting ahead of you, let me know and I'll stop. What's coming is a reckoning, right? Because we've had the great resignation, and I use that in air quotes, a little bit like going from my grass is slightly burnt here, so I'm going to jump to the other side of the because it looks greener and it winds up being astroturf. And so then I'm going to jump back. So we've gone through the great resignation. We've gone through people who have gone, because of COVID, gone through a very intense, and this is not just a couple, we're talking about a good portion of the population has gone through and said, I am now a bit clearer on how messed up my life is and what I want my life to be like and what my balances are. And so with the reckoning that's coming is that brands that don't get with the program and undergo this mindset shift and look at their sales teams differently and look at their sales team as being ambassadors and being advisors and being champions and being the face of the brand, are going to find themselves out of business. Now, those are harsh words, and people will say, oh, wow, she's a consultant. She's just, spouting rhetoric. It's happening. It's happening.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things, of course, is jobs that used to need real live human beings to sell. You started out by talking about you had a number, early on. And today, marketing can drive a lot of buyers through the process to buy without a salesperson being involved. So my observation is salespeople better be good at value transfer, or you might as well buy it from Amazon. If there's,
well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, that was. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true, but it's also endemic of the problem, right? Why do people not want to engage with a salesperson? Well, because the experience historically has not been particularly positive, and that they haven't realized the value. And what's happening in marketing is equally interesting. Marketing in aggregate or in general has dropped the ball, right? In many ways, right? It is not a profession that is looked upon fondly within an organization because it hasn't been revenue oriented and it hasn't basically delivered. So what happens is, well, we're just going to automate everything, right? We're just going to put it out there on e-commerce, and you can go deal with a chatbot, which, by the way, I really cannot stand chatbots. And so what's happened is the customer, this is the buyer has basically said, well, I really don't want to deal with you. And so I'm going to deal with the automation. But when push comes to shove, and multiple studies have been done on this, regardless of generation, regardless of age, which is generation, regardless of gender, regardless of country, when push comes to shove, the buyer, the customer, wants to talk to someone on the phone, right? They want to talk to a salesperson. They want to talk to a technical support. They want to talk to somebody, right? So this notion that I'm going to automate everything on that interaction is a myth. It's not real. AI will not replace that. AI is not mature enough. And so brands need to look at, say, again, let's go back to the customer saying, at what point is automation what that customer wants? And at what point is automation not what that customer wants, right? It's not like, fudge icing on a cake, right? You just like smear it all over the place, right? It really takes strategic looking at those interactions and saying, yes, I'm going to allow that customer to drive this process and define my interaction plan, because in the end, they're doing it anyway. So stop fighting it.
And I'm guessing, being a customer, there are times I'm making a decision of which is the best of the worst. Is the total automation better than the aggravating salesperson? Or is the salesperson, even though they're aggravating, able to answer questions I could have never possibly asked through pure automation? So I'm wondering if there's a, your pathway that we talked about earlier, if that isn't the kind of the principled way that we define which and when of those two ways and what they really should be able to do.
And that's exactly what the Seller's Compass does, right? That's exactly what it does, in that we work with companies to understand how buyers, what do they do at every stage? And so there's a series of stages. And then take that map and then go back in the organization. And I'll tell you another story. Maybe this makes it a little bit clearer. So PayScale, which is in crowdsourced compensation data, absolutely amazing company, SaaS. This is some years ago. They were trying to figure out why they had churn, right? This is classic SaaS, 3-year contract. And so we wound up doing a rather extensive amount of work with customers by size of company, by industry, by geography, by products, to say one loss never considered, right? In their particular case, we did it at this level of detail in order to understand the gap analysis, as well as what was the path or what was the journey, right, that these customers took for each one of these different types, right? I want to call them cells, right? These different subsegments. And kind of what we found out, and to make a long story very short, is what we found out was what most SaaS companies have done, right? They're a little bit better at it these days, but not 100%. What most SaaS companies done is there's this whole push, sell, salesperson's involved, contract is signed, punted over to customer success or somebody who's responsible for onboarding. You've got training involved, you got technical support involved, you got all these overtouching. The customer is in the vendor world live, right? This is an old euphemism, right? They're in production, so to speak. Okay, we're done. We're moving on. And then the renewal's not, okay, we're going to renew in 2 years and 6 months. Okay, that we're going to send them some generic stuff in between. And then we're going to start overtouching them in 2 years and 6 months, right? Meanwhile, right? And then companies wonder why there's churn at the cohort level and why there's churn overall. And what we found was what customers really wanted was, give me one point of contact. Okay, transition from sales to customer success. Do not quota customer success, because that's in direct conflict to what their job is, but let the customer success coordinate and manage the training and the onboarding. And once the customer's in production, what they wanted was, I want you to touch me once a quarter, either a phone call or an email. The email needs to be relevant to me, my size company, my industry, my position, but we definitely want to have a deep dive. How am I doing once a year? So that's 4 contacts a year, right? And then by the time you get to the 2-year, 6-month mark, when you're about to do the 3-year renewal, it's a no-brainer, right? Yep. Okay, that
changes your reoccurring revenue percentage.
Exactly. And we re-engineered and reorganized the company, right? So sales, customer success no longer had quota. That went back to sales, right? And then all of a sudden that solved that problem. It wasn't overly complex, but it was saying, okay, this is what the customer wants. Let's do it. It works.
It goes back to what you said in the first 5 minutes. It's that difference between kind of the arrogant headquarters and the really understanding who your ideal customer is, and then matching what they want, what they define as value.
Yeah. And it's not that hard. It's literally not that hard. They just say, let go. And, you know, companies are so afraid of, if I let go of control and I invite the customer in, either through cabs and co-creations and all these different things, if I invite the customer in, I'm going to fail. No, you're going to grow twice as fast, you know?
You know, when you talk about the fear of I'm going to fail, is some of that I'm afraid to justify this to ownership or Wall Street or the media or whoever's going to ask me, how did you change that? Why did you change that? You took away the number from that group. You know, is that part of what's going on?
No, I think, and again, there's this problem with generalizations, right? In some cases, you know, being a CEO or being a founder is a real ego rush, but it's also massive amounts of fear, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to fail. I don't want to let my parents down, my peers, my neighbors, my employees, right? But there's a, you know, you're not a CEO because you're an altruist, right? We're all CEOs because there's a good amount of ego involved. And if I say I am now going to let go, right? I am basically saying I am now no longer the CEO. Okay, this is what's going on up here. I'm no longer the CEO, therefore I am not the leader. I'm not, you know, I failed, right? That's not the case with every CEO, right? But I see a lot of that. I think one of the most interesting companies that we've worked with that I point to say, if you really want to watch a CEO that leads from the heart and the head, is to look at Coupa, COUPA, you know, with Rob Bernstein. You know, Rob, I mean, I've known Rob for a very, very long time, you know, and watched him follow his head and his heart without getting wrapped up in all of you know the trappings of CEO-ship. I mean, you know, he's worth a lot, but you know, you would never know it. But I think a lot of that is this fear, and it's tough being a CEO, right? It's really, really hard. I think where it comes down to the team, the leadership team, right? You know, CEOs need to surround themselves with not people that are like them, but people that are experts in their own particular areas, and that it's managed as a team, not as a hierarchy.
Yeah, that's interesting, because one of the things that always surprises me is every CEO wants to scale, and they want to have a succession plan, and they want to be sustainable, and they want innovation and operational excellence. And when you think about those things they want, the team has to deliver it all. You know, the CEO can't deliver any of those things by themselves. Yet they're afraid to give up the power or the accountability to those groups, and just kind of let them do the best they can. I'm always surprised at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough, you know, it's a tough thing to navigate, and it comes down to having the emotional maturity or the EQ, and knowing thyself. And again, some CEOs can do this very well, and some cannot, right? And there's no difference between genders. It's a tough thing. I think as I look at organizations going forward, right, I think the more the CEOs that can, what I call sit back, it's sort of like being in that mosh pit, and you're going to throw yourself into that mosh pit, right? And you're going to believe and count on people catching you and holding up. The more CEOs can do that, the more they're going to find their organizations are going to be that much more productive and that much more, you know, successful. And it's because fundamentally what's happening is something that has been in the academic world for a very, very long time. And it's called these self-organizing teams, right? There was an article in HBR not too long ago about that. And I had a really good snicker about that because, this is something that I had written about, almost 20 years ago. And we're seeing that, thank you to the COVID and thank you to being virtual, is that teams will naturally, or people will naturally come together. You see it on Slack, you see it in Slack communities, and what brings them together are shared values and common goals. If I have shared values and common goals, right, I'm going to work much more productively and achieve those goals based upon mixing and matching our various talents than if it's mandated and told. So the cat is out of the bag, right? We are so far down this path of self-organizing teams, and it's so becoming, without it being labeled that, part of that culture, that how we manage, which is the whole debate about hybrid versus remote, how we manage needs to fundamentally change. And CEOs need to, again, let go and go back into the mosh pit and say, I'm going to believe, and I'm going to trust but verify, right? And I'm going to lead from setting goals.
I love the shared value and common goals. As I look at organizations, I see lots of really good people, lots of people working really hard, being very frustrated. And being the outsider, I get to see that they don't have shared value and common goals, and they're all working really, really, really hard, but they're really pulling against each other most of the time instead of working together for a common outcome. And that's a huge challenge. And if you also, I see people do the same thing with customers. If they don't figure out what an ideal customer is, then every customer is okay, and the customers are pulling them in those shared values and purposes in different directions the same way their fellow staff members are. That's how we call that the cost of the chaos to produce revenue. And people don't realize that's 20 to 30% of your top line in a B2B company.
Yeah, it's true. That's really true. And I think that, I think if companies can spend a little less time on their BHAG and a little less time on OKRs and all of this, what I call structure, not that none of it's bad, it's not bad, but spend more time on really what are the shared values, what are the values that the CEO and the founder and the management team really want in this organization, and what are common goals. I mean, the story behind common goals is and what we don't do in organizations, which is what we do when we work with our customers, is if I understand what a common goal is, there's something that has to go with that, right? We all have a goal that we want to make $50 million this year, right? If the team and the company doesn't understand that these are the resources that are available, meaning we've got 10 people, okay, maybe my numbers aren't right. We've got 1,000 people, and we've just raised funding, but it's only 20 million, and having that level of transparency around these are the common goals, but these are the resources, enables teams, even all the way down to the front line, to make better decisions. Then you don't have this conversation between sales and marketing like this. Then you have the conversation that's saying, hey, okay, there's $100, right? Okay, sales, you want the $100 to hire a new salesperson. Marketing, you want $100 to do X, Y, and Z. Well, how about this? Let's get together and say, if there's only $100, how do we negotiate something that is that achieves the most return, right? That takes the conflict out of that mix. And too often, we don't have common goals, and then we don't share transparently in organizations with what their resources are. Many, many years ago, I interviewed this CEO, and actually it's on video. It was absolutely amazing. So he's in a fishbowl, right? He's got the glass walls, and he would come in. I'd never seen a CEO do this. He would come in every morning, and he would write on his, with a marker on his wall that was glass, this is what his schedule was today. This is how much is in the bank. This is how much is in receivables. This is how much is in payables. This is how much is in the pipeline. right? And so the bottom line being, people would come by and they would look by, oh, he's got a meeting with the banker today. Oh, we've got a customer coming in. Oh, and all of a sudden, like, well, oh, wow, we're behind on receivables. Yeah, maybe now's not a good time to ask for this, that, or the other, right? And it was very subtle, but it was immensely powerful, that level of transparency. And he did it with his customers. I mean, it was really amazing. It was amazing.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So this has been great. We could go all day. But the last thing I'd like to ask you is, think about two groups. Think about the senior leadership out there, and then think about young people early in their career. And what's the advice you have, given what you see is coming and the changes that are, we're in the middle of and are never going to get out of? What's your advice for those two groups?
Well, I'm going to start off with the younger people, because that is, that's hard, right? They're in a tough spot, right? So my advice to them is, yeah, your parents or your peers are going to push you to go to the university, right, and get a degree. You may want to go do that, but think long and hard whether you want to go do that, right? Companies nowadays are no longer taking the degree. Yes, if you got a master's degree from MIT, that might be a different story. But they're no longer taking the degree as being a proxy that you're going to be a good employee, which is what the degree served 20 years ago. Okay, this person has a bachelor's degree from this university. Their GPA was 3.9 or 4.0. That's a proxy that they will be a good employee, right? So rather, understand what your strengths are and go get a bunch of certifications, right? If you really want to be a digital artist, go get a bunch of certifications. That's going to carry more weight. Second point is get a bunch of allies, meaning go find mentors, people that, this, and it's not one person. Right. Go find mentors that are very good in this area or very good in that area that can help you navigate the ropes and not make, common mistakes that we all make. We all are going to make mistakes. So just lighten up on yourself and go get a bunch of mentors, right? And they're going to do it and listen, right? Yes, they're old, okay, but they have a lot of experience. They've been down that road. So that's my second piece of advice. The third piece of advice is, you own your career. Do not expect your employer to own your career. They don't care. All right. So you're responsible for you.inc. To executive management, my words are probably also similar, but that says, reach back and pull up, reach back and make room for that rising boy or gal or guy, that rising Black, Asian, Latinx, LGBTQ individuals, because they're just like you, right? And create entry-level positions. Yeah, they don't pay a lot, and yeah, they're a lot of work, right? But you know what? If we have an obligation to create onboarding ramps for younger generations. It doesn't happen magically, and the guy down the street's not going to do it. So, just suck it up and make it happen. And be a mentor, be an ally.
Wow, that is excellent, excellent. I love your slant on the two come together and really are self-fulfilling. When the younger ones recognize they have a responsibility and the seniors recognize they have a responsibility, and you probably get some amazing outcomes. So, very last question for you. What would you like to tell the people watching the podcast that we haven't talked about?
People ought to watch this podcast because experience speaks. So it's not a lot of BS. It's not a lot of hype, not a lot of egos coming out on the table. This podcast is about real life experience that can make or break your business and show you a path on how to drive your revenue so that you are successful.
Terrific, Christine. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. And everybody, this is great, and please enjoy it and come back for the next one. Thanks.
Thank you, Rick.